Hello again everyone, we're back again on extract 4, today considering figure 4.2, having already considered figure 4.1. Figure 4.1 was posing the question as to whether or not the slowdown in world trade was due to falling GDP growth rates. Figure 4.2 is posing the question, is the slowdown in world trade, although remember it is still rising as mentioned in paragraph 1 of the extract, however, is this slowdown due to greater regionalisation? On this chart we have 21 years of data, so just a little bit over 2 decades, and you can see that it is split into 4 main sections. Trade between developed countries, trade between developed and developing countries, trade between developing countries, and trade for unspecified destinations. So what can we glean from this data set? Well, the first thing to notice, and again forgive me if I'm pointing out the obvious, but the trade between developed countries is far and away the greatest proportion of trade in 1990, in 2000 and in 2011. So if we take 1990 for example, trade between developed countries accounts for approximately 57%, and bear in mind that it is a percentage that we're given, not a value or a volume. In 2000 obviously it fell a little bit to about 50%, and then in 2011 trade between developed countries has come back up again to around about the 57% mark. Across that time period, trade between developed countries such as the UK and developing countries such as say Zambia, we can see what's happened there. So in 1990 the proportion of that trade was around about, let's see what we're talking there, maybe 32-33%. In 2000 it was, we've gone from 50 down to about maybe about 35, something like that, and then in 2011 we're back to a similar value that we had in 1990, so around about the 32-33% mark. Trade between developing countries is very small, as you can see, and obviously there are certain reasons for that. Now in the specification, one of the potential 4-mark questions is that you might be asked to outline the pattern of global trade. Now this diagram would be an ideal diagram to describe in order to answer that particular question. We can see that there are two main trade flows, the trade between developed countries, and then the other main trade flow is the trade between developed and developing countries. It's interesting to note that the developing countries haven't really made much inroads over that sort of 2-decade period, so they're still hovering around the 30% trade mark with the developed world. So in spite of globalization, in spite of opening up of markets, clearly the developing nations of the world are still struggling to either access those markets, or they're struggling to produce goods and services which the developed world are actually interested in. So there are a few key points really to note from this diagram as follows. First of all, the 4 main trade flows, as we've already discussed. The 2 big ones we've obviously highlighted. Trade diversion is something which you could maybe comment on when you're discussing this diagram. Trade diversion takes place when countries group together in regional trading blocs, such as the European Union and NAFTA, and it means that trade moves from outside of that bloc to inside the bloc. Now obviously when the countries of Europe formed the European Union, or when the North America formed the North American Free Trade Agreement. Previously, they may have been importing goods and services from destinations and countries outside of that free trade area. But whenever you form a regional trading bloc, because of the customs union that goes alongside of that and the common external tariff, it means that it actually becomes cheaper to trade within that regional area. And so one of the reasons why Zambia, for example, may be having difficulty trading with the developed world is for that very reason. Perhaps trade did take place with Zambia previously, but now, with the existence of the regional trading bloc, it is cheaper for the UK to import products which maybe it previously imported from Zambia. It's cheaper to import them now from within the European Union, because there is free trade between nations in the European Union. There are no tariffs, whereas goods coming in from outside are subject to tariffs. So that's something that you may consider. We can see that in 2 decades the developing nations have not made significant gains into markets in the developed world. Another reason might be that they are trading primary goods in exchange for secondary goods. So all they are doing is simply servicing the developed world. And so there's not a great deal of trade going on between the developing nations and the developed world, because they're not producing anything other than primary goods. And then finally, trade between developing nations remains small. Obviously the developing nations, in terms of GDP per capita, those numbers are very small, so that there is not the demand from one developing nation to another. And the opportunities, the access to markets, the infrastructure, etc., those things simply are not there.